The Canary Trainer by Nicholas Meyer. Copyright 1993 by Nicholas Meyer. This book is read by David Case. There is a foreword by the editor, Nicholas Meyer, as follows. Beinecker Library, Department of Special Collections, Yale University, New Haven, Connecticut, December the 11th, 1992. Dear Mr. Meyer, I am Assistant Curator for Special Collections at the Beinecker, and I'm writing to ask your advice, and also your assistance. As you may know, the Beinecker is the recipient of an enormous number of valuable papers and manuscripts from donors the world over. Recently, we have transferred our entire catalogue from an analog to a digitalized computer format in order to facilitate referencing, a process that has consumed several months and $2 million. Along the way, we have unearthed several documents which were not properly identified or studied at the time of their acquisition. Among the papers on repository of the library are several pertaining to the estate of Martha Hudson, whose brother-in-law, Gerald Forrester, was a distinguished Yale alumnus, '03. The university has been in possession of these papers for over 50 years. I am ashamed to confess that the name Martha Hudson did not mean anything to my predecessor, and so I fear her papers escaped the scrutiny they deserved. It was only when the digital catalogue transfer occurred that we realized that this Martha Hudson was for 30 years the housekeeper of Sherlock Holmes. Most of Mrs. Hudson's papers are of little interest. They seem mainly to consist of housekeeping accounts that shed some light, but not much, on prices and priorities in a late Victorian, Edwardian bachelor establishment, and as such will perhaps fascinate social historians specializing in the period. The reason I'm writing you, however, is that among the Hudson papers was discovered a manuscript purporting to be by Holmes's biographer, John H. Watson. How it came to be included among Mrs. Hudson's household accounts, we have no way of knowing. Possibly because the bulk of the material is in fact a transcription of a lengthy deposition by Holmes himself, that is, her employer, there may have been some confusion as to authorship. How this resulted in her coming into possession of the manuscript we cannot explain. Mr. Forrester himself passed on in 1953, and has no heirs who might enlighten us on the subject. Knowing of your past work in this field, the library wonders if you would be interested in reading, editing, and annotating the text for publication. I will be away over the holiday, but back after the new year, when I can be reached at the above address, by telephone or by fax. If we do not speak before then, have a Merry Christmas. Sincerely, Fred Malcolm, Assistant Curator, Special Collections. This letter explains as well as I could how the following manuscript has come to light. I don't mean to seem churlish, but it is astonishing to me that library scholarship is in such a sorry state that a find of such potential significance should have been allowed to gather dust on the shelf of a major university for half a century. It's no damn good having piles of documents in your collection if no one bothers to read them. And it isn't a sufficient cop-out to point the finger at the Reagan and Bush administration's attitude towards education and research, and bemoan the fact that there aren't enough scholars to go round. The blame cannot simply be laid at the door of such a recent development. The stuff has been sitting there for years. At this rate, more parts of Huckleberry Finn, for whom the bell tolls, and goodness knows what else, are still destined to languish unpublished, not in someone's attic, which I could understand, but in the very precincts of academia that are supposed to protect and preserve them for the rest of us. Enough. A few words about the manuscript itself. Since the discovery of the so-called Swingline Dobson text in 1970, an entire cottage industry of newly discovered Watsonian manuscripts has cluttered the field of Sherlockian scholarship. Some may well be authentic, others palpably are not. Enthusiastic perpetrators are second in their creative zeal only to Howard Hughes's autobiographers and those writing entries into Hitler's diaries. The chief problem posed by any Watsonian text must, of course, be the question of authenticity. In the case of the present manuscript, known as the Canary Trainer, the question of provenance is complicated by a number of factors. First, although the paper and ink conform to the proper time and place, and the manuscript itself appears to be indisputably written in Watson's hand, the paper and ink have been vouched for by the Forensics Department of Scotland Yard and Professor Van Meegeren of the National Gallery, London. The handwriting has been certified as Watson's by 2 experts in the field, whom I am not at liberty to name, from Langley, Virginia. This is not a case in which Watson appears as either a witness or a participant. Watson's text was seemingly dictated in whole or part by Holmes himself, which greatly confuses the issue of authorial voice, one of the crucial methods by which Sherlockian scholars seek to identify a genuine text. The voice of Holmes is not the voice of Watson, and while a case related by Holmes himself is not unique, The Adventure of the Lion's Mane comes readily to mind as another example. It does entail stylistic differences which can only serve to perplex those wishing to make a definitive authentication. It is equally difficult to rule out Watson's contribution entirely. As I have noted, the manuscript is in his own hand, and therefore there can be no way of knowing to what degree the doctor altered, shortened, or otherwise amended Holmes's story. Why it was never typed, which would doubtless have entailed more corrections and alterations on Watson's part, I cannot guess. Perhaps a revised and completed typescript does, or did, exist somewhere else. If it hasn't been destroyed, many of these questions may be answered more fully some day. Holmes may have been off and running onto something else before Watson, who seems to have been asking the questions, had a chance to tidy up a bunch of loose ends. The manuscript does break off with the sudden arrival of Herbert Asquith, and Watson may idly have supposed he could finish it up later. Only later never came. For that matter, it is impossible to say to what degree Holmes typically exercised editorial control over a Watsonian text. On the one hand, he is constantly quoted as denigrating Watson's efforts, deriding them for their sensational content and their exclusion of pure logic, producing much of the same effect as if you had worked a love story or an elopement into the 5th proposition of Euclid. But on the other hand, it is clear that these same accounts have been published with his consent. Holmes, like many a famous figure, may well have connived at his own public image. As for the writing itself, the evidence is contradictory as to whether or not Watson was taking pure dictation. Parts of the manuscript bear the impress of hasty composition. The writing is nearly illegible, with abbreviations and other symptoms of an ad hoc nature, suggesting a kind of improvised shorthand that might have been prompted by the need to keep pace with the speaker. In other places, however, the penmanship, as well as the prose style itself, suggest a more leisurely method of composition, one in which Watson might well be creating as opposed to merely copying. A word about Americanisms. As I felt obliged to point out in my introduction to the manuscript known as the West End Horror, many amateur sleuths believe they can detect a spurious Watson text by pointing out American expressions, thereby concluding that these are forgeries from the New World. It must be reiterated that since both Holmes and Watson spent significant amounts of time in the United States, such Americanisms may prove nothing of the kind. Watson practiced medicine in San Francisco, per William Baring Gould. Holmes spent a good portion of his life in America, both as a young and as an older man. Indeed, at the end of the present manuscript, he was bound for Chicago on a case which would consume the better part of 2 years under cover. He was fond of American English, and by 1914 he was telling Watson that after 2 years in America, "My well of English seems to be permanently defiled," his last bow. As it happens, American locutions pepper all the Watson case histories, and the novice is advised not to set too much store by them.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?